Trump tried to break Canada. Canada broke his strategy instead. The moment Ontario flipped the switch, everything changed. One province, one surcharge. And suddenly 1.5 million American homes were staring at higher electricity bills, not because of a storm, not because of a grid failure, but because a trade war that was supposed to bring Canada to its knees had started flowing in the wrong direction, back into America. That is not how this was supposed to go. Trump's team had the script written already. Hit Canada with 25% tariffs, cite fentanyl at the border, watch Ottawa panic and negotiate. The end. Except Canada didn't panic. Canada prepared. And what happened next revealed something the administration did not want Americans to see. That the country they were treating as a dependent had its hands on switches they couldn't afford to have flipped. This is the story they didn't lead with on the evening news. Stay with me. The official reason for these tariffs was fentanyl. But there's a number buried in the data that should have stopped the entire plan before it started. Let's go back to the stated justification. The Trump administration launched 25% tariffs on Canadian goods and 10% on Canadian energy. The public argument? Border security. Fentanyl. Canada was framed as a leaky door for a deadly drug crisis. That framing moved fast across every major network. Here is the number nobody amplified enough. Less than 1%. That is the share of fentanyl seized at the U.S. border that came from Canada. Less than 1%. Canada had already launched a $1.3 billion border security initiative, a dedicated fentanyl task force, and in January 2025 alone, fentanyl seizures from Canada dropped 97% compared to the previous month. 97%. The reason behind the tariffs was not solid. It was scaffolding. And when your reason is scaffolding, your plan is too. Canada saw that immediately. And instead of playing defense, it started aiming at the structural cracks underneath Trump's approach. If you want analysis that goes past the headline, this channel exists for exactly that. Hit subscribe before the next section because this gets bigger. Canada didn't just counter with tariffs. It did something more calculated. It mapped exactly which American districts would feel the most pain, and the targeting was surgical. Ottawa announced 25% counter tariffs on $30 billion worth of American goods immediately. Orange juice, peanut butter, beer, wine, motorcycles, appliances, cosmetics. The list reads like a shopping cart because that is precisely the point. These were not random categories. These were the everyday staples that show up on kitchen tables in swing states because Canada had done its homework. A Wilson Center analysis confirmed what Ottawa already knew. The counter-tariff targets were structured to hit harder in Republican-leaning states and competitive electoral districts. Canada was not just countering economically. It was applying pressure politically from the inside of the American system outward. Then came Ontario. Premier Doug Ford announced a $10 per megawatt-hour surcharge on electricity exported to New York, Michigan, and Minnesota. Ontario's power feeds roughly 1.5 million American homes. That surcharge had the potential to generate hundreds of thousands of dollars daily. And more importantly, it transformed the trade war from a negotiating room conversation into something people could feel when they opened their electricity bills. That is when the temperature changed. Trump escalated. He threatened to raise steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada to 50%. And then, within hours, Ontario announced it would pause the surcharge and come to the table. And the White House pulled back from 50%, returned to 25%, just like that. Read that sequence carefully. Canadian pressure arrived. Trump reacted with emotion. Trump retreated. That is not leverage. That is the loss of it. This is the moment most analysts glossed over. Subscribe and stay with me, because the next section is where the real structural damage becomes clear. Trump's tariffs were designed to increase Canada's dependence on America. The data shows they did the exact opposite, and that reversal may be the most lasting consequence of this entire trade war. On March 13th, Ottawa matched the U.S. steel and aluminum tariffs dollar for dollar, $29.8 billion in counter tariffs covering steel, aluminum, tools, computers, servers, and industrial goods. Not symbolic, not theatrical, exactly matched. Canadian officials said it plainly. Canadian steel and aluminum are not peripheral to American manufacturing. They are woven into it. Defense production, shipbuilding, auto manufacturing, energy infrastructure. These are not industries you can protect by taxing their inputs and expect costs to not flow downstream to American workers, manufacturers, and consumers. The auto sector made this concrete. When Washington placed 25% tariffs on imported vehicles, Canada applied the same rate to American vehicles that failed USMCA rules. Mark Carney described Canada's approach in one precise line: maximum effect in the United States, minimum effect in Canada. That line is not posturing. It is engineering. Consider what the North American auto system actually looks like. Components cross the US-Canada border multiple times before a single vehicle is finished. Canada's auto industry supports 125,000 direct jobs and nearly 500,000 connected ones. Windsor is tied to Michigan. Ontario is wired into Ohio. These are not two separate systems in a disagreement. This is one system with a fault line running through it, and Washington pulled on both sides. The Bank of Canada confirmed what economic disruption at this scale does in practice. Companies began delaying investment. Hiring slowed. Sales forecasts dropped. Lending tightened. Businesses on both sides of the border started building in uncertainty as a permanent operating assumption. Uncertainty does not stay inside national borders. It spreads. It slows. It costs. But here is the turn that changes the entire arc of this story. And it is the part that will define North American trade for years ahead. Trump's intention was to make Canada more dependent on the United States. The tariffs were supposed to be a demonstration of asymmetric power. Canada needs us more than we need them. That was the thesis. The tariffs proved the opposite thesis. Within days of the escalation, Canada's provincial leaders convened and accelerated every internal trade reform that had been sitting on the shelf for years. Removing domestic trade barriers between provinces, streamlining worker mobility, fast-tracking 30-day credential recognition, expanding internal commerce. The Prime Minister framed the tariff shock not as a wound, but as a catalyst. The Canadian government's own projections suggested that removing internal trade barriers alone could add up to $200 billion to the Canadian economy. $200 billion. Built not from American trade, but from reducing dependence on it. That is the structural failure of the strategy. When your pressure tactic causes the target to build a stronger version of itself outside your reach, you have not demonstrated leverage. You have demonstrated your own limits. And the numbers underneath the framing were always uncomfortable for the official narrative. Canada is the largest buyer of American goods and services exports, purchasing more U.S. output than China, Japan, France, and the United Kingdom combined. Canada is the top export destination for 36 U.S. states and a top 3 market for 46. In 2023, Canada was the only one of America's 5 largest trade partners to run a manufacturing trade surplus with the United States, near $33 billion in America's favor. This was not a dependent economy being disciplined. This was an integrated partner being pushed toward the exit. The courts added a final layer. AP reporting confirmed that U.S. courts challenged significant sections of the broad tariff framework, even as appeals kept some measures alive. This matters not for the legal fine print, but for what it signals. That even within the United States, the strategy lacked stable institutional footing. Trump was not just facing Canadian resistance, he was facing institutional resistance at home. By late 2025, Canada refined its own position. It rolled back the broader counter tariffs while maintaining targeted measures on steel, aluminum, and automobiles. That disciplined adjustment says everything about how capable nations fight these battles. They don't react blindly. They sharpen, they hold the high ground positions, and release the rest. Because this was never just about tariffs. It was about a fundamental question. Can scale alone guarantee compliance in a deeply interconnected system? The answer, written across electricity grids, auto assembly lines, political maps, and trade data, is no. Not when the smaller party understands the system better than the louder one does. Not when pressure accelerates independence instead of surrender. Not when every retaliatory tariff is designed not just for economic impact, but for political effect inside your own borders. The human cost on both sides is real. The Canadian auto worker in Windsor waiting to hear about the next production pause. The American family in Michigan whose electricity bill rose because trade policy became infrastructure policy. The small manufacturer on either side of the border who cannot plan a hiring cycle because no one knows what the tariff environment will look like in 90 days. These are not abstractions. These are consequences that outlast news cycles. And the lasting instruction this conflict sends to every U.S. trading partner watching is perhaps the most significant consequence of all. When Washington uses shared dependence as a weapon without care, it teaches its partners to build exits. It teaches company executives to reduce single partner exposure. It teaches provinces, industries, and governments that access to the American market cannot be assumed as permanently stable, even inside a trade agreement Washington itself wrote. That lesson does not expire when the tariff rate changes. It reshapes decisions for a decade. So here is the question I want you to sit with. Trump set out to prove that Canada needed America more than America needed Canada. What did the data, the counter tariffs, the electricity surcharge, the legal challenges, and Canada's internal reform sprint actually prove? And what does that answer mean for the next time Washington reaches for this lever, whether the target is Canada again or someone else entirely? That story is already beginning. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay close, because this channel exists to show you what the headline skips.